Hi, my name's Phil Craig. I'm a writer, a TV producer, a lover of stories, and a connoisseur of scandal. And I'm on a mission to bring you the most scandalous tales ever told. So thanks for joining me here at the Scandal Mongers podcast.
Welcome once again, Scandal Mongers podcast, me, Phil Craig, and the warm and welcoming atmosphere of my Australian bar. Had a good week. A lot of you enjoyed Natalie Garrett talking about Queen Charlotte. I think we had 2,000 views already at the moment I'm recording this. That's just on YouTube. Lots of nice comments. Others are, I know, listening on audio apps. Lots of nice comments this week, actually. I got a review on the shop. You know, we have a shop, and I try and sell my mugs. Well, somebody wrote a really nice review, and if I can find it in my desktop, which is very cluttered. Here we go. Where is it? Where's my desktop? Oh my goodness, such amateurish stuff. Oh yes, here we go. Carolyn, who had bought a mug, I think, or maybe a t-shirt, I think it was a mug, decided to say on the shop that the podcast is intelligent, interesting, fair and well-reasoned. It deals with books and current issues and history. It's fun and, to be frank, rather addictive. Oh, thank you, Caroline, whoever you are. Appreciate that. Lots of nice comments on the show as well. This is a mouthful. Mulbinatu 6479. Great episode, and I'm looking forward to listening to your podcast next week about Kathleen Folbigg. Well, there we are. I haven't introduced it yet because I tend to rush ahead. That's right. This week I'm going to be talking to my friend Quentin McDermott about Kathleen Folbigg, and it's an amazing story. It's one of the great miscarriage of justice stories, I think, of our time, and I won't spoil it for you. Quentin has been part of the investigation that's led to this woman who'd served 20 years in prison, being released for crimes that she almost certainly did not commit. When you're freed on appeal, it's often because a judge says that you can't be convicted beyond reasonable doubt and that the original jury and judge got it wrong. I think when you hear Quentin tell the story of how this woman came to be prosecuted and how it took so long, despite things that were happening in other parts of the world, this story all takes place in Australia. When you see the many, many mistakes and assumptions, and I think it's fair to say misogynistic assumptions about motherhood and the way people react to motherhood and the way things were written and misinterpreted. Anyway, I'm sure you'll agree, it's more than just beyond reasonable doubt or not. This is a case of, well, Quentin calls it state torture of somebody who is herself a victim. Anyway, I won't spoil it for you. Kathleen Folbigg coming up soon, and you can always jump to the interview if you get bored of me going on about stuff. Anyway, I'm going to read a couple more reviews because I like doing that. Yes, I talk about Meghan and Harry, as I do now and again. BMAC P9S said, people seem to forget how forgiving our late Queen was. So it's only natural that Charles also sees the value in forgiveness. People often say that what Meghan and Harry has done is unforgivable. Is it really? Yeah, well, I'm inclined to agree with that myself, as you know. Marianne Oz, Marianne's been on here many times. Hi, Marianne. She says, I don't like Meghan's behaviour or her vapid comments, but at this point, she could run into a burning building to rescue a baby and she would still be thrashed. I sometimes smell the whiff of sulphur, a bit like a witch burning. Well, I agree with that too. I've made many criticisms of her and of Harry, but I think this has gone too far. I think now it's almost like if you want to find fault in someone, you always will find a way. And a lot of the things that are said criticising what Meghan and Harry do when they go on an event or a visit, you could say the exact same thing about the official roles if you wanted to, but people don't. So yeah, I think it's unfair. This is not turning into a Harry and Meghan love fest. I hated Spare and I hated the Netflix show, but I do think it's gone a bit far, and I think a reconciliation is not only possible but likely and to be welcomed. There, I'll get trashed in my comments again, no doubt. But as I say, you can jump ahead, and here's a moment where you might really want to jump ahead, because I shared on Twitter the fact that I've been to a play last week. Mrs. Craig and I went to a play in nearby Richmond Theatre. And the play was about the making of Jaws. It's called The Shark is Broken. It's written and performed partly by Ian Shaw, who's Robert Shaw's son. Robert Shaw play the iconic Quint, the shark hunter, the drunken, aggressive shark hunter, with an interesting backstory in the film Jaws, as many of you will know. Anyway, the play was brilliant, and I shared a few thoughts about it. And it reminded me that I have quite an interesting tale that connects me to sharks. It's got nothing to do with Scandal. Like I say, jump ahead to Kathleen Folbigg by all means. But several people asked me to tell this anecdote, which I don't think I ever have before. So I'm going to. So this is the story of how Phil Craig saved Shark Week. All right, maybe a bit of hyperbole there, but it kind of is. So Shark Week, as many of you will know, especially Americans, but if you don't know, for a long time, it was one of the biggest weeks on American TV. The Discovery Channel always made lots of great films and documentaries about sharks. It became fun. It became a kind of almost like a sort of a cultural milestone in American history, like a holiday. People had Shark Week parties, and barbecues, and things by the pool. And it grew and grew, and eventually they would do a week of solid shark programming. And it was the highlight of cable TV, and it went all around the world. And now I'm talking when I was involved in the sort of 2000s, really, when it was enormous. And I think they were making an awful lot of money from it. I'm sure it's still very popular, but of course now with the streamers, cable TV is not as massive as it was. But I'm now talking about 2007, probably one of the high points of American cable. And I was lucky enough to be asked by Discovery to make the premiere film for that year's Shark Week. This is a big deal. It was a multi-million-pound commission, a big drama documentary about the USS Indianapolis, also known as the greatest shark attack in history. And if you're following, that's the story that lies behind Jaws, because in the film Jaws, Quint, the shark hunter, tells this remarkable story. It's an iconic clip of how he had been on the USS Indianapolis when it sank, and 1,200 men go in the water, and only about 300 get out. And the rest of them are eaten by sharks over 3 or 4 terrible days and nights. We wanted to make the film, and we were commissioned to make the film, a big drama documentary about this event. There were still quite a few veterans left. I got to meet lots of them. I got to meet one man, extraordinary man, who still had his wallet that he'd had in the water for all these days. And he miraculously had still the photograph, the little black and white picture he'd had of his wife in 1945. And he was still married to her in 2007. I met them both. So yeah, there were lots of veterans to interview, but there was lots of good science, why do sharks attack? Actually, it turned out that an awful lot of these people hadn't been killed by sharks. They'd been eaten, which is different. Sharks are quite smart. They would rather wait for a meal and scavenge than fight someone who might injure them. So yes, some people were killed, but most of the ones that were eaten died in the water of exposure and their injuries and so on. So it's a fascinating film. And anyway, we pulled off a real coup. We got Richard Dreyfuss to narrate it. Now, Richard Dreyfuss, as again many of you will know, is one of the stars of Jaws as well. He's portrayed in this play. Portrayed in the play as a slightly high-maintenance, rather highly strung man. And if you've ever read his biography, you'll see why that is often said about him. But he is a great American actor, an incredible voice, real Shakespearean style in his delivery when he puts his mind to it. And we were lucky to get him. And we thought, here we are, Shark Week, premiere show, Richard Dreyfuss. Oh my goodness. And Discovery were really behind it. They put a lot of money into marketing. There was going to be parties. They paid for 1,000 yellow taxis in New York to have a fin on the roof. That's how big Shark Week was then. And with our show on it, and Richard's name, no doubt, because he was a big draw to get that wonderful voice to narrate the program. Anyway, it was quite hard work. I flew to San Diego to record the voiceover with Richard for the show. And, he was great. He is amazing. But, he had notes. He had thoughts. This is a man who has been directed by Steven Spielberg. So when Phil Craig turns up, maybe, perhaps you could write it this way better, Phil, or maybe this. There were a few issues in the recording session. And at one point, I said, do you know what, Richard? I thought I would disarm him with my charm. I said, do you know what, Richard? I think you and I would get on a lot better if you realised we had one very important thing in common. We've both been in Oscar-winning movies. And Dreyfuss looked at me. And then suddenly to my left, the sound recordist, a man I'd known for about 4 hours, looked at me and said, Chariots of Fire. Which is extraordinary in and of itself, because it's true. I am in Chariots of Fire. for about 10 seconds. An extra had 2 lines. I was called a featured extra. But this guy, we're now talking 2007. So that's what, 30 odd years after the film. He must have been a big fan of the film, but here I am, a little bit older than I was then. I was a student. It was all filmed at Cambridge when I was a student. Anyway, he recognized me. That was incredible. So that sort of broke the ice. Richard and I got on fine. He did an amazing narration for the show. You can find clips of it online quite easily. It's called Ocean of Fear. Anyway, a big part of any TV show is the promotion and the launch and the marketing, especially for Shark Week, which, as I say, is it's become like a cultural event. Some people loved it. Some people hated it. Some people said it was, demonizing sharks. Some people said the science was dodgy, and this show we made really had excellent science in it, actually. Anyway, there was a big launch event in Los Angeles in front of all the TV critics in America and lots of other journalists. And Richard was advertised as the main speaker, and we brought some of these veterans and their families to this event. And it was a huge, like an amphitheater. It was a Beverly Hills hotel, one of those places where the media throws. And the night before, there was this big party with champagne and dancing. I mean, it was amazing. One of the highlights of my career. I get a call. Richard's not really feeling it. He's not so well. He can't really face the journey. Oh my goodness. I mean, Richard might not come. Well, he's in 2 months. Can you call him? Gulp. If Richard doesn't turn up, the whole press launch of this show is going to fall a bit flat. He's the star turn, let's face it. They're not come to hear me talk, or even the veterans, to be fair. He's the star of Jaws, talking about an iconic shark story for Shark Week. Oh, my goodness. Oh, there's a twist to this. Uber mogul who now runs everything, David Zaslav, had just bought Discovery. I mean, I think like 6 months before. He was the new big boss of Discovery. And my boss, the president of the Discovery channel, a great woman called Jane Root, she worked for him now. He was going to come to this show. It was her first chance to impress him, that she was kicking Shark Week into new, even more brilliant territory. Pressure was on. Is there a quicker way to get him there? He can't really face the journey. I'm on the phone to Jane. Spend anything, do anything. What about a helicopter? Oh, that sounds good. I can be in and out quite quickly. Yes, you can. Oh, there's a helicopter place nearby. He lived near the border, down near San Diego, near the Mexican border. So that's only about an hour or so's flight from LA. So within the space of an hour, I rent a helicopter with my company credit card. God knows what it cost. I don't think it mattered to Discovery at that point. I fly down there. I arrive. Richard isn't ready. The clock is ticking. The show's on in about 2 hours. He's not quite dressed yet. His lovely wife, Svetlana, I think she was his 4th wife, they're still together. She answers the door and she becomes an ally, and she goes upstairs and helps him get dressed. He comes downstairs. He's not really feeling it, if I'm honest. I'm not sure he's loving this part. It's in his contract, though, of course. When you do a show, you have publicity clauses. And he'd been paid pretty well to do this. So we expected him to come. And I think Svetlana wants him to come too. And then Svetlana says, oh, can I come? I've got some friends in LA. I'd love to spend the day there. Fine. We all drive up to the helicopter pad, get in the helicopter. We're flying. We've got the president of Discovery on the phone. Is he coming? Is it fine? Yes, we're in the air. It's good. Oh, he didn't really have time for much breakfast. Can I have a steak? Oh, so I'm now talking to the president of the Discovery Channel, giving a steak order. Svetlana leaned in from behind and says, oh, I'd like a steak too. I'm giving food orders for this Hollywood icon and his wife in a helicopter, flying over Santa Barbara and Orange County into LA. We're coming down into the LAX airport. There's a little helicopter landing area and 2 black limos waiting to whisk me off. I mean, I feel like I'm in a movie at this point. And the whole thing is kind of slightly mad. Anyway, we get there. And Richard just turns it on. He's no longer a little bit difficult, a little bit, whatever the word you should use. He wasn't very enthusiastic earlier in the day. He is loving it. He walks over to all the veterans. He completely charms them. He gets on stage. He delivers an absolutely brilliant performance. He's funny. He says some very smart things about the show and also about Jaws. The press lap it up. It's written up in so many stories, newspaper stories, like front page coverage. And the show, when it goes out a couple of weeks later, I think even to this day, it's the highest rated Shark Week premiere ever. So there you are. That's how Phil Craig didn't exactly save Shark Week, but he saved that year's Shark Week. And there's an even funnier twist. to this story. A few years later, Jane, who I mentioned, suddenly called me up and said, Phil, look at the New York Times. Stormy Daniels and Donald Trump, when that story came out, it was my film that they watched on their second date. And she thought this is weird. She turned up to see Donald Trump because he paid for her company, and I guess she was expecting certain things to happen. And he wanted her to watch this film, my film. So there you are. I made a film that was so compelling. Not only did Donald Trump choose to watch it rather than sleeping with a porn star, he chose to watch it rather than sleeping with a porn star he'd already paid to sleep with him. So there you go. And all because of a helicopter ride with Richard Dreyfuss and an order for steak. Anyway, I do miss my TV career sometimes, although that was a rather nervous weekend, I have to say. Anyway, there you go. More TV anecdotes are available, some of them even as good as that one, if you find them interesting. If not, tell me. Anyway, now definitely, if you've not jumped to here already, it's time for the main event. As I say, Quentin McDermott, an old colleague of mine, we worked together on an iconic British TV series, World in Action, in the 80s, as young journalists. And we also worked together on a big Lance Armstrong project when I was at the ABC in Australia, which is where he is now. But he's led the way, well, he wouldn't claim to have led the way to get her released. But in terms of media coverage, pushing the story forward, working with various scientists and experts, he's helped right this wrong. So without further ado, let's go to Sydney, to Quentin, and I'll see you all after the break, where I promise there'll be no anecdotes about any Hollywood movie stars. Thanks. Bye. Quentin, thank you for joining me at my Australian bar from actual Australia.
It's great to be here, Phil, and I hope you're going well.
I'm going very well, thank you. Now, I've been in your flat. Does that laptop turn around? I think people need to see the view.
Well, okay. Well, I'm going to have to. I'll do a little bit of
come on, impromptu self-direction.
Moving here. Hang on.
This is where the last time I saw Q in person was in this flat, and this is the view, which lifts the spirit.
Can you see? Can you see through there or not?
No, it looks like a whiteout. Oh, wait a minute. Tilt it down a bit. Oh, well, anyway, that is Sydney. You can see the harbour somewhere out there.
Maybe we can do this again at the end. It is actually the Harbour Bridge we look over.
I know.
And we're incredibly fortunate. We've lived here for quite a few years. And we never get tired of it.
Of course you don't. No. Well, as people will know, Q and I are old mates. And he very graciously agreed to do this interview. What is it, 2 days after the book's published?
The book was published last week here in Australia on Wednesday, and then last Thursday in the UK. So if anyone's interested in the UK, they can pick up a copy anywhere, and it's published as an ebook and as an audio book as well, voiced by the author, no less.
Well, you probably couldn't afford anybody better, could you? But
well, that's true.
No, well, I mean, I often jot down a few notes, before these interviews. But I think I stopped after I reached page 6 of my notes, not of your book, of my notes, because there's just so much to talk about. So I'll stop blabbling on about Australia. And I sort of say, books about miscarriages of justice are often written by campaigning journalists, and you are a campaigning journalist. But very often you can tell from the very first paragraph that the author is completely invested on one side or the other. And what I love about this book is actually for the first half of it, you begin thinking, oh, God, maybe she did do it. You lay out the case so well, because I think you want people to understand why this terrible miscarriage of justice happened. So I guess my first question to you is, was that intentional on your part? Did you want to try and make it as difficult as possible to prove your own case?
Yeah, totally, Phil. And it's interesting because there was a part of me, having studied the case for so long, there was a part of me that thought, well, I'm just kind of going to go for broke and kind of call her innocent from the first word in the book kind of thing. And then I spoke to a wonderful editor at HarperCollins who said, no, you can't do that. You've got to explain why the jury actually found her guilty and why the police thought she might have done it and so on. Of course, I mean, I hope it makes the narrative far more interesting to put the case for the prosecution, which I've tried to do faithfully, and I've tried to do it in some detail so that people can understand why indeed she was convicted.
No, I mean, life is messy and people are complicated. And I think you paint a picture of a difficult character, a troubled relationship, a troubled family background, anger issues. So maybe we should just start by, since we have, we can talk for over half an hour, if that's okay with you.
Of course.
Just paint a portrait of her before she had her first child.
Yes. So, look, this is all obviously in the book in the first chapter that tells the story of how, when she was 18 months old, her father, who was had emigrated to Australia from Wales, he was Welsh, and he had connections with the Sydney underworld. He had an argument with her mother, and he ended up killing her. He ended up stabbing her 24 times in the street. And it was the most appalling, brutal. Thank God she herself, as in Kathleen Folbigg, wasn't there. But it gave her the most terrible start in life because, of course, he was instantly arrested. He was put on trial. Bizarrely, he pleaded not guilty when he went on trial. But she was farmed out, first of all, to a maternal uncle. And then when they kind of for whatever reason, and this is still shrouded in some mystery, they decided they couldn't take care of her. And she was then put into two children's homes in succession, which must have been horrific. And of course, she'd been, she no longer had her mother, who was her biological mother, who was dead. And she had been effectively abandoned by her father because he was in prison by this time. And then she was picked up by a foster family, and she was taken up to Newcastle, to a suburb of Newcastle called Kotara. And the problem there, I think, was that both her foster parents were much, much older than her. And although she had an older foster sister and an older foster brother, they were much older than her. And so it was a very kind of odd arrangement. And the mother, Deirdre, was really quite unpleasant to her at times. She wanted her to kind of do a lot of the chores in the house, and she punished her and, physically hit her if she didn't kind of, carry them out to her satisfaction. And when Kathy was a teenager, she was very constrained by her mother in the home and couldn't go out with her friends as much as she wanted to. And so, when she was a ward of the state. So she was a state ward, and she was constantly being monitored by social workers as well. And so when she reached the age of 18 and she was no longer a ward of the state, I think suddenly, everything kind of burst free, and she wanted to kind of let herself go a bit. And she met her future husband, Craig, on a dance floor in Newcastle when she was 18, and he was 6 years older than her. He swept her off her feet. And then very rapidly, really, they married, and then they started a family together.
Well, we talk about the first child who dies, and the death of that child is put down initially to Southern Infant Death Syndrome, SIDS, which was
Right.
I remember covering this story in the 90s in Britain. There were numerous stories of women. It was usually the women accused of killing their children, whereas in fact they'd had what was called cot deaths. And this produced a series of court cases. And this is probably a good time to introduce the title of the book, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. So the title of the book is Meadows Law, and that comes from a kind of theory or saying or mantra, if you like, that was propagated by a British paediatrician, Professor Sir Roy Meadow. And I'm paraphrasing, but essentially what he said was, 1, sudden death of an infant in a family is a tragedy. 2 is suspicious. And 3 is murder, unless proven otherwise. And of course, he gave evidence at the trials of some of these poor women who had been accused of killing their children. And he not only did he give evidence that, that Meadows' law, if you like, was correct, but he also came up with some bizarre and completely inaccurate statistics to suggest how unlikely it was For example, in the famous case of Sally Clark, a solicitor who was convicted of killing two of her children, he came up with the statistic that the chances of both of them dying from natural causes was 1 in 73 million. And this was just, to put it bluntly, rubbish. And the interesting thing in Kathleen Folbigg's case, and there were other British cases as well, but the interesting thing in Kathleen Folbigg's case is that Sally Clark was acquitted in early 2003 before Kathy went on trial. And she went on trial accused of killing all 4 of her children. So she had 4 children, one after the other, between 1989 and 1999, and she was accused of killing all 4. But a couple of months earlier, Sally Clark had actually been acquitted on appeal. And speaking personally, I think it's, it's one of the great injustices of her case that she was put on trial at all following the debunking of Professor Roy Meadows' theory.
Well, yes, we're rushing ahead of ourselves a little, but you're right. I mean, Meadows ends up basically in disgrace after all.
Yes, that's right, and he did end up in disgrace, but his reputation was kind of clawed back to a certain extent. But the problem was that by then the damage was done in terms of the evidence he had given at the trials of several British women. So he didn't give evidence. It's interesting, he didn't give evidence. I don't know whether we want to get to the Kathy's trial yet or not, but he didn't give evidence at Kathy's trial. And indeed, the actual phrase Meadows' law was ruled inadmissible at her trial. But at her committal hearing, there was another so-called expert who suggested, following on from what Roy Meadow had said in Sally Clark's case, who suggested that the chances of 4 children in the same family, 4 infants dying from natural causes, was 1 in a trillion. Now, which again was even more ludicrous. And the problem there was that although this particular witness didn't give evidence at her trial, her report had gone to her committal, and it had been reported in the media. And so the whole kind of idea of these 4 deaths and whether or not they could be from natural causes was infected by this theory.
Well, you're right. These are the sort of statistics which will affect a jury, whether they hear them in court or have heard them in the papers before. But we are rushing ahead. Let's go back to the early years of this story. The first child, Caleb, dies. It's put down to SIDS. Obviously, it's very distressing for the family, but there's no particular interest by the state. It's a tragedy. It happens. She gets pregnant again with a child called Patrick. And at this time, there's another factor which I think we should introduce into the story because it's really important, is she starts writing odd, maybe even incriminating, disturbing things in her diaries, like how she might cope as a mother, given that she's already lost a child. And these diaries become really important later on. What's your take on the kind of things that she wrote and whether they really should have been given the weight that they were given later?
Yes. So, Phil, my take on that is kind of twofold, or maybe even threefold. The first point to make here, I think, is that, for example, with Caleb and maybe to a lesser extent with Patrick and the other children, well, actually not to a lesser extent, she wrote very, very detailed kind of day by day, sometimes hour by hour accounts of, how they were feeding, how they were sleeping, what their condition was, and so on. And that on its own was evidence that she was deeply concerned about each of the children and their health and their well-being. And, you have almost, as I say, a kind of hour-by-hour account of Caleb's life. He only lived till 19 days old before he died. And the same thing happens with Patrick, who suffered something called an ALTI, an acute or apparent life-threatening event, when he was a few months old, and then he developed blindness and epilepsy, and eventually he died following epileptic seizures. But so there's that element to the diaries. And then the second element is kind of ruminations, if you like, and admittedly quite strange remarks she makes in some of her diaries, which could be interpreted as being incriminating, but only if you kind of take it a step further. Okay. So at no point in her diaries ever did she kind of use the words, I harmed Patrick or Caleb or Sarah or Laura. She didn't, there was no statement of an act of agency, if you like, by her, which interestingly is different to some other cases we may come to talk about later on in this discussion. But there are remarks she made which are troubling. And so, for example, in relation to one of her children, she said that when she died, she left with a bit of help. And that was interpreted by a lot of people. And I myself, when I first read that, I thought, oh my God, what does that mean? She killed this child. But she had an explanation eventually. She had explanations for some of these more troubling events. But then the third point to note here, I think, is that these diary entries were used against her in a very proactive fashion. So again, I'm leaping forward to the trial, but at the trial, the senior Crown prosecutor, Mark Tedeschi, interpreted some of these diary entries as being, actual admissions of guilt. And he kind of reworded them almost to say, what could this mean other than, I killed Sarah? So they were used against her. They were weaponized, if you like, against her. But it was only years and years and years later that these diaries were properly examined by expert psychologists and psychiatrists, almost all of whom, all of whom years later came to the same conclusion, which was that there was nothing incriminating in them at all.
No, and I think many mothers, especially young mothers, would sympathise here that, she talks about being stressed and whether she's going to be able to cope, and obviously with her own background, and she has issues sometimes with her husband. She just pours her heart out. You can select and fill it out particular lines in these very long documents to make her look bad, but at no point is there anything even close to an admission of guilt. Let's get to Sarah, the third child, because that's another thing you introduce here, which is, you're trying to paint a picture of why she was convicted. And this is her anger issues. She sometimes loses her temper with the child, and her husband, who she has a kind of love-hate relationship with sometimes, he observes this, and later, again, this will be used against her. So how did this arise as a factor in the case?
Well, I think, Phil, the truth is that none of this arose, actually, until after the fourth child, Laura, had died. Okay. And so what I'm saying here is that, as you so rightly said, after Caleb's death, there was no kind of interest from the police, for example, in his death. And the same applies to Patrick's death, the death of the second child. After the third child, Sarah, died, there were police officers who kind of went to the scene of her death as a kind of, because that's what they were supposed to do, but not because there was any suspicion attached to her death, and not because there was a police investigation about to be launched. And indeed, it wasn't launched after Sarah's death. So 3 children had died. It was only after the fourth child, Laura, died, that very strong suspicion was raised, and it was raised purely and simply on the basis of Meadows' law. So what happened was that there was a detective in Singleton called Detective Bernie Ryan, who reported that this was the fourth child in the Folbigg family. This was then passed on by another police officer to a preeminent forensic pathologist called Professor John Hilton. And he made the remark, 4 is, if I can use the phrase, fucking murder. And from that point on, I think the police thought, okay, well, if the professionals are saying this must be murder, it must be murder. We've got to investigate it. And the other element here, which I think was intensely unhelpful to Kathleen, was the fact that forensic pathologists in general who had come up with the Meadows law theory, and there were a couple of other medical examiners in the United States who'd come up with an almost identical theory. Their proposition was that when this happened, if 3 or more children in a family, infants in a family, died and it was murder, it was almost always the mother who had committed the murder. And so at that point, they then started to kind of delve into Kathy's life in the most minute detail, and interviewed Craig, her husband, about her, and they kind of blew up, really, these kind of flashes of temper that occasionally Kathy had into temper with murderous intent. And really, there was absolutely no evidence to suggest that, following these flashes of temper, or in the midst of them, she had actually killed her children. But
indeed, as you point out, with Sarah, which obviously she's very carefully monitored from the word go by her family and by the state, because she said 3 of her siblings are dead. With Sarah, the first health event she has that's really worrying, she stops breathing. Kathy is nowhere near her. She's under the care of a friend, which I would have thought was an important...
This was Laura. This was the 4th child.
Laura.
You're right, Bill. This was
Laura,
the 4th child. And this is something that I highlighted a few years ago during the course of following this story and investigating it. Laura was taken care of by a good friend of Kathy's. And while this friend was taking care of Laura, she appeared to stop breathing. She appeared to have an acute life-threatening event, and she had to kind of scoop her up off the floor or wherever she was, and kind of suddenly, this child, Laura, started breathing again. And this was clear evidence that actually there was something wrong with Laura. But at her trial, at Kathy's trial, it was kind of swept aside. It wasn't given any real weight at all. And so what they focused on instead of that was they focused on Kathy's moods and on what she'd written in her diaries. And they focused on something called coincidence evidence, which essentially is the prosecution saying, well, look, all these things the same things have happened with each child. For example, she found them all, when they were either moribund or had died, and therefore it's not a coincidence, and she must have killed them. But one of the most shocking things, if I may say, Phil, that one of the things that really shocked me when looking at the prosecution case was that it's always been recognized. She was accused of smothering each of them in turn, okay? Now, it's always been recognized that you can smother an infant under the age of about a year without there being any physical evidence of having done so. Okay, so they weaponized this as well. They used this absence of evidence because there was no evidence, no actual positive evidence that she had smothered any of the children. So they used this as as an argument for, well, look, okay, all this other evidence suggests that she killed them, so it must have been by smothering. She must have smothered them, which I find just kind of Kafkaesque, really, and a scandalous way to prosecute.
Well, as you say, with Laura, I mean, Laura was nearly 2, wasn't she? She was 18 months.
She was 18. She was more than 18 months old, and she had teeth. Obviously, she'd been growing teeth, and as other pathologists pointed out later on, if indeed she'd been smothered, a child of 18 months old is going to put up a fight, and almost invariably there will be marks inside the mouth. From pressure on the face and the teeth against the inside of the lips. Okay, there were no such marks. What there was in Laura's case was a very clear and identified case of a disease called myocarditis, which is inflammation of the heart muscle, which can be harmless and children and teenagers and others can kind of get over very quickly, but can also be fatal. And much later on in the story, there were enormous debates between different forensic pathologists about whether or not the myocarditis suffered by Laura was actually fatal. But overwhelmingly, the pathologists in that debate came down on the side that it certainly was fatal or potentially fatal. And the pathologist who carried out the post-mortem on Laura, the autopsy, he gave a verdict, if you like, in his autopsy that her death was, the cause of death was undetermined. But almost every other forensic pathologist who looked at this later said, well, I would have ascribed her death to myocarditis. But of course, if he had done that, then the whole pack of cards would have collapsed for the prosecution, because
Well, let's get to the trial, because you make the incredibly important
yeah,
point in your book that one of the things that's so stunning about this case is the complete inversion of the well-established concept of burden of proof. Normally, you'd expect the prosecutors to have to prove that you've done something, especially something as massive and important as a murder. Actually, the trial really consists of Kathy having to prove that she didn't, which is
exactly.
mind-blowing, really.
Yeah, as I say, I think it's Kafkaesque, and as I say, it's this idea that smothering can leave no traces, therefore she must have smothered them
Yeah.
because there are no
And,
signs.
and there are
I mean,
four of them, so it's effing murder. It must be. And
yes,
now we're going to prove it,
yes,
which is,
yes,
I mean, you could understand why the police, I guess, especially if Meadows' law was in their head and they hadn't noticed what had happened in Britain, because now we're at 2003, they press on and they press on. And yeah, the trial is indeed Kafkaesque.
yeah. And I think although I think that Detective Bernie Ryan, who led the investigation, did some things which were questionable, frankly. I think you also have to acknowledge that the whole investigation was kicked off or supported by forensic pathologists who subscribed to Meadows' law. And it's interesting that some of the medical experts approached by Detective Ryan were medical experts who also subscribed to Meadows' law.
Interesting. So you've got a
And
woman
so,
who's
yeah,
there's no forensic evidence at all. And then if this was a fight in a pub or a regular murder, so to speak, you'd need evidence that this person hit or stabbed or whatever this other person. None of that in this case. 4 deaths, no even tangential forensic evidence that Kathleen did it. So they have to rely on this idea of statistics and these tendentiously interpreted lines in the diary. That's it, isn't it?
yes, essentially it is. And of course, the diaries, just to get back to the diaries for a moment, the diaries are filled with expressions by Kathy of her blaming herself. And this is where, again, the prosecution kind of weaponized this and used it to suggest that she was, admitting her guilt to having killed her first 3 children. Whereas, in fact, of course, any mother who had lost one child, a single child, let alone 2 or 3, would be expressing guilt, would be blaming themselves for the child having died on their watch. I mean, that is an entirely natural reaction, I would suggest, for any mother or any father, for that matter, whose child has died, while in their care. So I think it was really a kind of cynical weaponization and wrong interpretation of these entries in the diaries. Now, one of the other things I discovered, actually only very recently, while researching this book, is that the senior counsel who represented Kathy at her trial, Peter Zara, appeared to believe that she was guilty. And I put this in the book, and this is because he was approached in the year after she was convicted in 2003, and he was approached the following year by clinical psychologist Dr. Sharmila Betts, who went on to write a report saying, these are not expressions of guilt, of culpability. These are expressions of, self-guilt, blaming herself. But anyway, she approached Peter Zara at a kind of law society conference privately and said to him, this is a terrible miscarriage of justice, isn't it? And she says, looked down at her over his glasses and said, you wouldn't think that if you'd read the diaries. And so this, I think, is hugely significant because one of the things that didn't happen at her trial was, that no expert psychologist or psychiatrist was called to give evidence during the actual trial in her defense, to give us a different interpretation. It simply didn't happen. They didn't,
Well, and as you say, I think I'm quoting a book, so I'm writing down what you said. The diaries were clearly, was it a weary and emotional person writing down her feelings as a cathartic process, expressing emotions that have often been reported as common amongst women experiencing childbirth and motherhood and the pressures associated with it. I mean, if that had been that sentence alone, had that been read to the jury, might have changed everything.
Oh, totally, I think. And I think it's disgraceful that it didn't happen. But again, I have some sympathy with the defense because they were starved of resources, and they were effectively prevented from giving some of the medical evidence which they'd been researching before the trial. Mark Tedeschi, the senior Crown prosecutor, I think was extremely skillful in how he presented the case and how he presented the diary entries. And in his closing address, made this kind of famous remark that, is it possible that, Caleb, Patrick, Sarah, and Laura all died from natural causes? Well, yes, it is. But equally, it's possible that Farmer Joe would wake up one morning, look out of his window, and see 4 piglets born to a sow. Incidentally, a highly disrespectful metaphor. And each of these piglets had sprouted wings and flown away. And so what he was saying was, it was literally, he used the adjective fantastical as well, at another point. He was saying that it is literally impossible, literally an impossibility, that 3 or 4 children, infants in a family, could have died from separate natural causes, which is, essentially what occurred. And he was wrong to do so, because actually there were other cases of families where this had happened.
Well, let's get to this, because I want to get into it, and I want to get into your involvement in the story, which is really important. She's convicted. All bets are off now in the media. She's written up as like the worst mother in history. She's the most terrible person. She's completely demonized, has an awful time in prison, as you'd expect. People, though, still have faith in her, some of her friends, and a kind of community grows, which you become part of, and which starts to unpick all of this, and it takes a long time. Maybe the best way of doing this is for you to do it from your point of view, when you first got involved in the story.
Well, to be frank, Phil, I got involved really quite late, actually, because what happened before I got involved, long time before I got involved, a couple of key things happened I just want to mention. So in 2007, I think it was, another woman in Victoria, not in New South Wales. Kathy was convicted in New South Wales. Another woman called Carol Mathey in Victoria also lost 4 children. She was also charged with killing them. And she appeared before a judge in a kind of preliminary, there was a preliminary hearing in front of a judge in Victoria with almost all of the same expert witnesses and forensic pathologists who had appeared in the prosecution of Kathy 4 years earlier. And the judge essentially dismissed the case. He said that, what he had heard kind of didn't stack up, essentially. I'm paraphrasing. And so that raises the possibility that had Kathy actually been prosecuted a few years later in Victoria, she might never have been convicted. But anyway, that was one key case that happened. The second thing that happened was that in 2011, a legal academic called Emma Cunliffe wrote a book called Murder, Medicine and Motherhood, which essentially was about the trial and the media treatment of the case. And she came to the conclusion, and she wrote, it was a very thorough academic book, that, Kathy wasn't guilty, that she was innocent. Now, that was then picked up by friends of Kathy's in Newcastle. And then it was picked up by lawyers in Newcastle who in 2015 put together a petition which they submitted to the then Governor of New South Wales and was looked at by Gabrielle Upton, who was then the Attorney General of New South Wales. And it was 3 years after that, or 2 years after that, that I became involved in the sense of becoming interested in the case. I had reported about another case which shared the same senior Crown prosecutor, Mark Tedeschi, and that was the case of Gordon Wood. And I'd reported a Four Corners story on Gordon Wood a few years earlier, which essentially called into question his guilt. And not long after that, Gordon Wood was acquitted on appeal and released. And one of the things that I did in that particular story was I interviewed an expert witness who had been an absolutely key expert witness at Gordon Wood's trial. And he was a man, Associate Professor Rod Cross, who'd come up with the theory that Gordon Wood had thrown his girlfriend, Caroline Byrne, over the cliffs at the Gap, which was then a notorious suicide spot in Sydney, to her death on the rocks below. It was a very gruesome story, and it was an entirely fanciful theory. And I interviewed Associate Professor Cross, and I said to him, because his expertise was in the area not of biomechanics, but of plasma physics. And I said to him, what qualifications do you have in biomechanics? And he said, I don't. He had no professional qualifications in biomechanics, and yet he was being called into court to act as an expert witness as to how exactly Gordon Wood might have thrown his girlfriend over the cliff. And he said, I'm largely self-taught. And at that point, I thought, well, hang on, there's something a bit dodgy about this case. And about the way this case was prosecuted. And indeed, when Gordon Wood was finally acquitted, the criticism of Mr. Tedeschi was fierce from the judges at the appeal court. So anyway, later on, as I say, I became interested in the Folbigg case, partly because Kathleen Folbigg was prosecuted by the same senior Crown prosecutor, Mark Tedeschi, but also because in both cases there was clearly no actual forensic evidence, linking the accused to
it's one of those.
Body.
He must have done it. She must have done it. Now you
exactly.
prove otherwise, which is, as I say, a reversal of the normal process of justice.
Exactly. And in Gordon Wood's case, all sorts of people, including journalists, came up with a whole series of kind of lurid, conspiracy theories as to why Caroline Byrne might have been murdered and how. And in the same way, really, although it's an entirely different case, obviously, in the Folbigg case, Mr. Tedeschi came up with, I think, at least 3 different possible motives she might have had for smothering each of her children in turn. So one of them, for example, was that she hadn't actually intended to kill them, but that, she got stressed with them because they weren't settling and going to sleep. And so she tried to kind of suffocate them in order to get them to sleep, but not in order to kill them. So that was one theory. And then there was another theory, which was that, she became enraged with the children and simply killed them. And, what I said in the book was, well, he was trying to have an each way bet here, really. It's, what is it? Which is it? What is the motive? Essentially there was no forensic evidence in either of those cases. So that's how I became involved. And then I started researching it more. I talked to the authors of the petition, the 2015 petition, and I helped to produce an episode of Australian Story, which went to air in August 2018. And by then, it had been more than 3 years since the petition had been lodged. And
making that program, that's when you met her, isn't it?
That's right. So I was introduced to her. I was taken to Silverwater Prison by a friend of hers who very kindly introduced me to her. And we kind of, I wouldn't say we were kind of bosom buddies from the word go, but I didn't get any sense, from meeting her that here was a kind of, raging, murderous woman. Far from it. She seemed quite composed, quite self-contained, and she had a sense of humor. She didn't seem particularly kind of nervous to be meeting me as an investigative journalist. And I just, and interestingly, on another occasion, when we went to film outside another prison where she'd been moved to, I spoke to one of the prison guards who was kind of escorting us around the perimeter. And he said, and I just had a private chat with him, and he said, we don't believe she did it. And I found that very telling, because it's, it's that old thing of, the people inside the prison who know who are guilty and who are innocent and who are guilty are, the prison staff.
Interesting.
So that was interesting too.
I'm looking at the clock as I speak to you. I've already gone over half an hour. I want to just try and sum up what really happened during the course of these your own program and the science that was being gathered, essentially it was to prove that there was a reasonable possibility that these children died from a variety of natural causes. And I know genetics plays a part in that too. And I guess slowly but surely it became obvious that you could interpret all of these deaths in a very different way. What was the key moment, the eureka moment, if you like, in that process?
Well, I think the eureka moment, Phil, certainly from the scientific point of view, was that after our Australian story went to air, first of all, 9 days later, finally, Mr. Speakman, Mark Speakman, who was then the Attorney General in New South Wales, he announced an inquiry into her convictions. So that was a key moment. But the eureka moment, funnily enough, happened, I think, quite fortuitously, it's fair to say, following our program, because there was a young man called Dave Wallace, who is both a lawyer and also trained in genetics, which is pretty remarkable. And he watched the program, and when he'd been studying genetics, he had always wondered about the Folbigg case, as it happens. And he after he'd seen the story we put out, which focused in some detail on the myocarditis suffered by Laura, the fourth child, he thought, well, maybe there really is a genetic cause for Laura's death, and maybe, who knows, maybe for the deaths of the other children. And he got a very eminent immunogeneticist, Professor Carola Vinuesa, Spanish professor. He kind of got her involved, and they then went off to see Kathleen Folbigg, and they took a kind of buccal swab from inside her cheek and so on, and a saliva sample of her saliva. They had it genetically sequenced. They kind of got all the data on the laptops and so on. And Professor Vinuesa and a colleague of hers called Todor Azov looked at this, one afternoon in, I think it was November. It would have been November. I'm sorry, I'm struggling here. 2018, I think. And they suddenly kind of together said, "Oh my God, calm too," kind of thing. Now, to someone who isn't scientifically trained, that means nothing. But essentially what they discovered was a cardiac genetic mutation present in Kathy herself, which at least in theory was potentially fatal. Now, of course, she was kind of living and healthy, reasonably healthy at the time. But they then went on from that moment to discover that indeed her two daughters, Sarah and Laura, the third and fourth children, also had this potentially fatal.
So they got blood tests from the dead girls.
They managed to. Well, they managed to get blood tests from the heel prick cards that babies that are taken from babies when they're born and so on, and other samples. But essentially, they were able, which was a remarkable achievement, to sequence these blood spots, if you like, from years and decades ago, and they discovered that, as I say, the two daughters had this cardiac genetic mutation, and then that was then fed into the first of two inquiries into her convictions. And I won't bore you with the kind of granular detail of it, and I'm not a genetics expert anyway, so I couldn't, even if I wanted to. But essentially, what happened was that at the first inquiry, the judge, the former district court chief judge, Reginald Blanche, who was in charge of the inquiry, he essentially, I wouldn't say he dismissed the genetic evidence, but he preferred the evidence of some other scientists who gave evidence, who said, look, clinically, this doesn't all stack up. And he actually came back and said that the evidence he had heard reinforced her guilt, which astonished and dismayed a lot of people. But then fast forward, and Professor Vinuesa then arranged for this genetic mutation to be tested in the lab. And there was a kind of international collaboration of scientists. And to cut a very long story short, they came back and confirmed that in their view, this was a pathological variant, which may well have triggered the deaths of the two girls. And that then fed into a second inquiry, where the judge there, Tom Bathurst, decided that yes, indeed, all the evidence he had heard, including fresh evidence about the diaries, raised reasonable doubt surrounding her convictions. So I think there was that one kind of eureka moment. The other, but just speaking personally, Phil, the other eureka moment for me was when I spoke to a professor of mathematics in the UK who actually had given evidence at Sally Clark's appeal, who essentially, and he wrote a report for Kathleen Folbigg. Essentially what he said was, okay, of course it's unlikely that 2 or 3 or 4 children in a family will die suddenly from natural causes, but actually it's even more unlikely that they will be deliberately murdered. And he had kind of done his research into homicides of children, infants in families, and there have been other studies of this which showed that actually the chances of a mother or a father kind of deliberately killing one child after another, 3 or 4 children, it's far less likely that that's going to happen than that they die from natural causes. And so, this was it was kind of overturning the basic.
And also, I think you point out somewhere in the book that there is evidence of clustering with sudden infant deaths.
Yeah, well, that's right. I mean, my understanding.
There are many cases, surprising number of cases, where 2 or 3 children, maybe it's the genetic mutation, maybe it's something else, but it does happen. It has happened.
Yes, there certainly are cases in families, as I understand it, where if a family suffers the tragedy of a SIDS death, that a second SIDS death, it actually becomes more likely, not less likely. And part of this may be environmental, or part of it may be medical, because of whatever genetic conditions or other conditions the children or the parents may hold. But it actually becomes, if anything, more likely. So, as I say, the whole kind of the whole theory of Meadows' law is kind of bowled over by this. And then I just think also, from a common sense point of view, if you put yourself in Kathy's shoes, and your first child dies because you smothered him. Just about, I don't believe this happened. I want to make this super clear. But supposing any mother, smothered their firstborn because they were in a state of rage or whatever, lost their temper, smothered the child, would you really go away and have another child and then do that to the second child? And then, all right, you've done it to 2 children, but you're going to have a third child and you do it to the third child? Oh, okay, I've now smothered 3 children and I have a 4th. I mean, to me, it's just, that is fantastical.
That is fantastical to use that word that was used against her. And also, of course, with the daughters, especially with Laura, the amount of care that's taken to monitor, to get some of these experts in, her blood, her breathing, she's all being checked all the time. And as we said, the first health event is with a friend. She's nowhere near. That alone really should have destroyed the original trial. I mean, the more you read your book, and you've been quite calm in this interview, but you're obviously angry. This is, I think you use the word state torture at one point, that this should never have come to court. And it was just this amalgamation of the Meadows law thing, the idea, well, she must have done it, mustn't she? And the fact that people didn't really understand genetics in the same way as they do now in 2003.
Absolutely. And of course, you don't need me to say that I think there's a large dollop of misogyny in all of this as well. Just as there was in the famous Lindy Chamberlain case, where the mothers were held to kind of standards of motherhood that fathers were never held to. I mean, Craig Folbigg, who most unfortunately died last year, he passed away, but Craig Folbigg, was not a great father, to put it mildly. He wasn't the one who got up in the middle of the night to take care of the children. He slept like a log right the way through, almost always. And she was the one who did all the caring. And I think that the kind of misogyny here is significant. And also, it's this whole thing of the demeanor of an accused when they're going to trial and how they look.
Yeah, well, in Lindy Chamberlain's case, that was very much a factor. She just didn't behave in the way that she was expected to behave, and they thought she was a bit weird, and she had strange religious ideas, and she must be guilty, mustn't she? That's the phrase, isn't it? That I think motivated motivated this whole story. The police decided she must be guilty, and then she couldn't prove she wasn't.
Exactly, and there's a lovely story that Kathy told one of her best friends, Megan, during the trial, which is in the book, where she rang up Megan, or Megan rang her, and she was kind of outside in the street, and Kathy says to Megan, "I really want to laugh, but I can't." And Megan says, "Well, why not? What's stopping you?" And she said, "Well, there's a photographer in front of me, and he's backing away, and he's backed into a bin and fallen over, but I can't laugh because of the way they'll use it." And of course, in her case, as in Lindsay Chamberlain's, this was absolutely true. Kathy knew what was going on here with the media. She knew that if she'd been photographed outside court after a day's hearing, laughing her head off because she'd seen something that was genuinely comical, that would be used against her in the media. But of course, she was in a no-win situation, because if she didn't laugh and if she was stony-faced, then she was stony-faced, and she was an unfeeling, callous, murderous bitch, basically.
Gosh.
And that is how I think women in these cases were treated by the media.
Well, you say in the book, I think this isn't really a book about happy endings, but what is her ending now? Is she in line for compensation? What does the rest of her life look like? Have you been in touch with her since she was released?
Yes, I have been in touch with her, and an added scandal is the fact that she was exonerated. She was acquitted. Verdicts of acquittal. So so legally she's innocent now. Were entered against her charges, her convictions, in December 2023. So here we are now, 14 or 15 months later on, and still, to my knowledge, she has not been given an offer of compensation. Now, that to me is completely scandalous. Her lawyers have submitted they've made an enormous submission detailing all the reasons why she should be substantially compensated, and that hasn't happened. Not only that, no one in the criminal justice system in New South Wales has offered a formal apology to her for what occurred. And, here is a case where if we're looking for kind of, the big theme, the big lesson from a case like this, she was completely failed by the criminal justice system in New South Wales. She should not have been prosecuted. She should not have been convicted. There's an appeal, which we haven't talked about, which she should have won, which she lost. She should not have lost the first inquiry. The inquiry didn't inquire in the way it should have done. And she should have had an apology, and she should have been richly compensated, and none of those things have happened.
Is that because at a senior level there are still people who think she did it and she got away with it?
I believe so, yes. No one, I want to make it clear, no one, at a senior level has said that to me personally, but I think it's pretty clear from their kind of whole body language, quite frankly, and the way they've behaved, that some of them certainly, I believe, still think that she's guilty. But the fact of the matter is, as I say, she has been acquitted. She's an innocent woman in the eyes of the law, and therefore it follows from that she deserves substantial compensation, because she spent 20 years of her life behind bars, far more than Sally Clark and other women in similar cases. And I think the other lesson, I just want to say this, the other lesson from this case is the delay, that, justice delayed is justice denied. And in her case, from 2015 right up until her acquittal in 2023, there were constant delays brought about by the failure of two attorney generals to actually, decide on two separate petitions which were lodged on her behalf. And, had this case been referred instead to a criminal cases review commission, which exists in the UK and which is entirely independent of the politicians, because the attorneys general in New South Wales are politically appointed. They're not entirely independent. And they may well be independent personally, as in, showing great integrity in the way they make their decisions. I'm not disputing that, but the look isn't good. So one of the huge lessons from this, I think, is that a criminal cases review commission needs to be set up either federally in Australia or in every state, and certainly in New South Wales, because those are, in other countries like the UK, they are commissions which exist to investigate miscarriages, potential miscarriages of justice thoroughly and rigorously. They have the resources to do so, and they have the ability to refer those cases, if they feel it's right, to courts of criminal appeal.
Well, I'm going to wrap this up
in New South Wales.
I'm going to wrap this up by saying Q and I both, in an earlier stage of our career, worked on a famous British current affairs program in Granada Television called World in Action, which some people think was a very famous exponent of the art of investigative journalism. And I think what you've done, Q, is in the highest traditions of that show and lots of other great shows and great writers. I mean, you downplay your role, but you did have a role in this story. I'm so grateful to you for writing this book and for doing the work you've done. And I'm sure that she is as well. And I know she's writing her own book, though, isn't she? In addition,
she is. Yes, that'll be out quite a lot later in the year.
Okay. Well, I hope yours does really well. It deserves to. And I hope that what you say about the need for to refresh the way that these cases are dealt with in Australia really does need to happen. Thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you, Phil. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Pleasure. I'll see you soon at the bar. Anyway, enjoy your evening. By the way, it's bloody freezing here. It's freezing cold.
Oh, I feel so sorry for you.
Enjoy a lovely warm evening in Sydney. I'll see you later.
I will.
Bye.
Thanks, Phil. Bye for now.
Well, there you are. I hope you agree. I think it's an open and shut case. When you actually look into the detail of it, how it happened, it should never come to court. You can understand. We can understand how it happened. And as I said in the interview with Quentin, he's very good at laying out how it seemed to the police at the time and how it seemed to her husband. Although, to be fair, the husband, he kind of goes back and forward. He changes his story. He's sympathetic to her, then he's not. It's a very, very interesting story about how a lot of people can come to believe something that when you stand back and look at it coldly in the light of actual, real scientific evidence, is implausible. It's suspicious when a number of people die, but if you can't prove that any of them died as a result of an action of a human being, and there's a good chance that some, at least of them, had real health problems, then how does that become a murder case? Anyway, let me know what you think. I'm sure that story will run and run. And I'm sure that Quentin will actually probably do more on it. I don't know whether we'll talk to him about it again, but I'd love to get him back to talk about Lance Armstrong, because I mentioned at the beginning, he and I worked on a show. I mean, he did lots of work before I even got to Australia. We did a big feature documentary about Lance, which won a few awards, in fact. And he brought lots of information out about Armstrong and drugs before it was all in the public domain, when it was just suggestions from some of his former cycling buddies. Although I'm not sure Lance ever really had buddies. I think he had cronies and he had enemies, and that was it. But that's another fantastic story and a bit of a scandal, which also actually, everything connects to the Discovery Channel. Because when I first worked for Discovery, they sponsored Lance Armstrong, and he turned up for a meeting to talk about Shark Week or whatever, and there was all Lance's bikes in the foyer of the Discovery HQ, and they disappeared rather quickly after a certain point. Anyway, it's been a long episode. Thank you for staying with it. I do appreciate your company. Yes, when I say now in future you should jump ahead to the interview, I should call it Jumping the Shark, shouldn't I? Jumping the Shark anecdote, or their equivalent. Anyway, thank you. Please keep watching. Please keep liking. Please keep subscribing. Oh, nearly a million. I know, 2 years and a few months, nearly 1 million downloads. I should pass that fairly soon, which when we started, I think Andrew and I were told 100,000 a year would be good. So we've done a lot better than that. And I think it's only going to get better. Thank you for your time and your company. See you again soon. Bye.
This has been a Podcast World production If you want to contact me, write to team@podcastworld.org, placing Scandalmongers in the heading, or you can reach out via the social media links in the show's bio. And if you've enjoyed this episode and you want to support the show, please consider taking a few seconds to hit the donate button found just below this video. Many thanks, and see you next week.